The concept of naturalism is generally regarded positively in contemporary philosophy. The term is often employed to refer to reductive naturalism, according to which, in principle, everything is reducible to the subject matter of the natural sciences. Closely linked to this view is the arguably most widespread metaphysical position today, physicalism, the view that everything can be reduced to the physical. In this video, it will be argued that a significant widening of the concept of naturalism may be helpful. A broad liberal naturalism that holds that the criteria for a view to qualify as naturalistic is not linked to any specific metaphysics. This type of naturalism allows for the inclusion of non-materialistic metaphysics, including forms of dualism and idealism. Given the positive connotations of the term naturalistic, such an inclusion seems helpful in legitimizing potentially fruitful research into less conventional alternatives to physicalism and materialism. This might well turn out to be of value, not only from a theoretical perspective, but from an existential standpoint as well. There are reasonably strong arguments supporting the endorsement of reductive naturalism and physicalism, not least the remarkable success of the natural sciences. However, the reductive physicalist position is not beyond criticism. In particular, it encounters difficulty with the problem of free will and with normative questions regarding both ethics and aesthetics. It has been criticized for its failure to adequately explain consciousness and the mind-body relationship. In addition, it has been argued that reductive naturalism constitutes an overly restrictive and non-self-justifying conception of naturalism. 6 broad claims constitute naturalism as it is often understood. 1. The idea of first philosophy is rejected. 2. Philosophy is viewed as continuous with the sciences. 3. Supernatural entities and processes are disbelieved. 4. The mind is understood within a physicalist framework. 5. Non-naturalism about ethics and values is rejected. And 6. A priorism is rejected as well. Interpreted narrowly, these claims seem to fittingly describe the basic tenets of reductive naturalism. As an alternative to reductive naturalism, various forms of liberal naturalism have been developed. Here, these 6 claims are interpreted less narrowly. Liberal naturalism generally claims that certain objects and causes inaccessible to scientific study possess irreducible existence. These include persons, reason, and self-awareness. And ordinary objects as well are perceived as things that cannot be fully explained using only the methods of the natural sciences. Moreover, the normative facts play a central role. This does not mean that there is a contradiction between the natural sciences and liberal naturalism, with the scientific view taking precedence, as would typically be the case when perceived from a reductive naturalist perspective. Instead, the two are seen as different approaches to understanding the same reality. Liberal naturalist positions generally try to avoid the problem of consciousness by perceiving themselves as merely an alternative approach to examining reality. For example, a person understood simply as an irreducible entity. This is a legitimate approach to handle this problem, but it is arguably not intellectually satisfying if the aim is a more explanatory and coherent worldview, a comprehensive, consistent, coherent metaphysics. Thus, even more far-reaching expansions of the concept of reductive naturalism beyond liberal naturalism have been proposed. Here, attachment to materialism or physicalism is explicitly reduced or even rejected. But in classifying these positions as naturalistic, it is emphasized that first, their positions include the existence of basic laws, and second, they assert compatibility with the results of contemporary science. This idea underpins the considerations in favor of broadening the concept of naturalism into a broad liberal naturalism, which will be outlined in what follows. The term nature can be used in a number of ways. It may refer to the opposite of that which is man-made, or to the opposite of the human environment. It may concern something distinctively human, or the term natural can be used to designate the opposite of the transcendent or abstract or non-empirical. When the perspective is extended from considerations of nature versus culture, for example, to actually ontological questions, the concept of naturalism can also be found in conjunction with those metaphysical views that are of absolute naturalistic character. That is, the idea that nature constitutes an ontological category of totality, of being all-encompassing, and in that sense, unbounded and absolute. Spinoza's identity of the substance, God, and nature can be interpreted as a classic example of such absolute naturalism. In the following, nature will be understood as a category of totality in this sense. Given the apparent shortcomings of physicalism and its limited explanatory power regarding central philosophical problems, not least the problem of consciousness, it seems worthwhile to take a closer, unbiased look at other approaches to metaphysical questions. It seems appropriate not to get stuck in any particular metaphysical position in advance, but to weigh the various positions in terms of relevant arguments. Opening up in this way to other metaphysical positions, including controversial views such as metaphysical idealism, the view that consciousness is more fundamental than the physical, means that the premises for inquiry radically shift, as at least four of the claims mentioned earlier on what constitutes naturalism no longer hold. Specifically, the rejection of the concept of first philosophy, the rejection of a priorism, viewing philosophy as a continuation of the sciences, and understanding the mind within a physicalist framework. Because physical realism does not constitute a fixed premise in this case, empirical study of the physical cannot form the final foundation upon which the nature of reality is examined. It instead becomes a matter of practicing metaphysics as traditionally conceived. Given this gap in conventional understanding, is it still reasonable to use the term naturalism? The methodological basis of the natural sciences is the idea that there are particular regularities or laws that express an apparently fixed natural order, which does either determine the behavior of nature or describe the necessities or regularities embedded therein. It is this basic idea that forms the fundament of metaphysical naturalism, an idea that must therefore be acknowledged as the crucial and decisive characteristic of a naturalistic view. That this is the case does not mean that the concept of metaphysical naturalism is then limited to physicalism or even metaphysical materialism. The idea that naturalism rests on the notion that particular laws or regularities are linked to the structure and behavior of reality is theoretically compatible with most traditional metaphysical positions, including variants of dualism, dual aspect theory, and metaphysical idealism. This is, of course, a very broad understanding of naturalism. However, an additional condition which provides some demarcation, follows from the above. The existence of an autonomous, transcendent entity which is not subject to these governing principles or laws of nature, required if the position is to be of universal character, such as a theistic God, is not compatible with this conception of naturalism. Hence, although naturalism is here conceived as a category of ontological totality, and as such can be broadly embraced, it cannot accommodate traditional religious belief systems in which the objective existence of an autonomous God is acknowledged. This demarcation of the concept of naturalism arguably increases the likelihood that the question of which is the most plausible conception of naturalism becomes of actually existential relevance. Whether a given metaphysics is perceived as existentially relevant is to a large extent based on the perception of the plausibility of that metaphysics for the individual in question. In the context of modernity, it seems reasonable to assume that such plausibility, at least the rational or philosophical kind, would be reduced for many people if an objectively existing nature transcending power or entity were to be included in the metaphysics. Thus, characterizing a metaphysics as naturalistic, arguably, all else being equal, increases the likelihood of existential relevance in the context of modernity. As discussed, the concept of naturalism has already been extended to some degree from the traditional reductive to regular liberal naturalism. However, as discussed, a further extension may be warranted. It is the belief that there are universal laws, regularities, or governing principles for nature's behavior, and thus no autonomous entities, that is crucial when it comes to naturalism. Not any demand for attachments to some specific metaphysical position, such as physicalism. Objections could be raised against such broadening of the term naturalism and naturalistic, and I'll briefly discuss some of them. Liberal naturalism has been subject to the criticism that if things such as objects, properties, and events are recognized as reducible to the purview of science and, at least in principle, can be explained by science, the position is too close to reductive or scientific naturalism to dissociate itself from it. And on the other hand, if such a reduction is not recognized, then liberal naturalism becomes unacceptable to those committed to a scientific worldview, in effect becoming supernaturalism. In the case of the broad liberal naturalism discussed in this video, the concern is not a too close connection to physicalist naturalism. The challenge is to maintain the distinction between this broad naturalism and supernaturalism. One particular form of supernaturalism is theistic supernaturalism, according to which God exists outside of nature. The existence of nature depends on God, and God is able to intervene in the world in a way that cannot be explained through the laws of nature. That this is incompatible with naturalism is in line with the broad liberal naturalism discussed here. However, some consider a view supernatural if it is committed to the existence of any entity or force that is in principle inexplicable by science or contradictory to scientific knowledge, or if it contains entities or forces that are utterly detached from the natural world and natural causal processes. Examples include the absolute and divine found in some variants of Neoplatonism or the nirvana of Buddhism. Following this line of thought, a position like metaphysical idealism would be considered non-naturalistic. However, such a position is not precluded from characterization as naturalistic under the broader understanding of naturalism outlined previously. What is decisive here is not concrete scientific theories or the empirical method, but whether the metaphysics in question includes fundamental principles or inherent structures that form the basis of universal lawfulness, while rejecting entities autonomous to these laws or principles, such as a theistic God. On the surface, a metaphysics such as idealism might appear to violate a constitutive claim of naturalism in that it breaks the causal closure of the physical world. The idea that all physical events must be due to physical causes, and thus it seems negates the physical laws of nature. Metaphysical idealism implies physical anti-realism, the idea that the physical world does not exist in itself. But this does not mean that what we experience as the physical world does not operate according to specific laws or principles. In this case, what appear to be genuine physical laws are instead metaphysical laws that appear as physical laws. Especially in the case of absolute idealism, broadly understood, where the seemingly independent physical world is the appearance of an underlying actually existing reality. This as opposed to, for instance, subjective idealism. Positing the existence of metaphysical principles governing the details of that appearance seems reasonable, especially given the well-defined patterns of the behavior of that appearance. This does not negate the laws of nature as we know them, since they can then be interpreted simply as the manifestation of the non-physical laws governing the behavior of that part of our experience that appears to us in the form of the physical world. The principle of causal closure must be viewed as a metaphysical assumption rather than a scientific result. The laws of physics are based on the generalizations of results obtained by causal experiments, where influences from autonomous external sources, such as the acts of conscious beings, are carefully avoided. Thus, the notion of causal closure arises naturally from such a generalization. As long as the principle of causal closure is conceived as restricted to the uninfluenced behavior of the apparently physical world, which is exactly the domain of the laws of nature, this principle is arguably compatible with absolute idealism. With nature thus understood as an ontological category of totality, it could also be objected that the term nature is then conceptually empty. If it simply covers everything that exists, it is no longer meaningful, and because broad liberal naturalism is based on this specific understanding of nature, this form of naturalism is undermined. However, broad liberal naturalism requires that all phenomena ultimately are grounded in governing principles or laws or regularities. Thus, any metaphysics that does not meet this requirement is not naturalistic in this sense. It follows then that the concept of naturalism, understood in this way, possesses actual and crucial and decisive content. Any theistic metaphysics, for example, is excluded. The world is simply natural. Okay, the broad liberal conception of naturalism permits the inclusion of metaphysical positions other than the reductive physicalist position or materialism in general. This is significant because the physicalist position seems to fall short on a number of issues, most notably regarding adequate handling of the problem of consciousness. Thus, it is of considerable interest to investigate views based on other metaphysical positions, in the hope of developing, or at least sketching, solutions to important philosophical problems. Under this broad liberal conception of naturalism, many such views could potentially be characterized as naturalistic. Simply because a metaphysical position different from physicalism or materialism forms the basis of a metaphysical thesis, this does not automatically exclude the possibility that the thesis might be characterized as a naturalistic metaphysics. Given the positive connotations of naturalistic, characterizing a metaphysics as non-naturalistic presumably in itself reduces its general perceived plausibility. This seems to be helpful in legitimizing potentially fruitful research into unconventional alternatives to physicalism and materialism. This might well turn out to be of value not only from a theoretical or academic perspective, but from an existential standpoint as well. Thanks.